forget. So how are we feeling? Is everybody doing okay? It's our midterm season here at SOU. Hopefully you guys aren't intensely overburdened or anything, but so we've got our midterm paper due this week on Sunday, and so hopefully you've been at least thinking about how you'll respond to one of the prompts, the prompt that you select. But are there any questions about that, about the midterm or anything else? No? All right. So
I'm excited for fall term so we can be in class again.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, I'm excited for that too. Well, hopefully we'll be face-to-face classes again in the fall.
Yeah.
Let's see, what was I gonna say? Oh, right. So I was able to grade and add comments to your first reflection paper on Descartes and the John Pollock short story. So I'm not sure what kind of alerts you guys get about that, but if you'd like to see my comments and my feedback, I usually embed the feedback in what looks like little yellow Post-it notes throughout the text. And so I'm not really sure. I thought that I should mention that because I don't know if it sometimes goes unnoticed by students. Yeah, Sophia just put in the chat, safe enough. Yeah, I don't know. And they're actually light. I would qualify this in a light way, pressuring faculty to consider returning to the classroom even in the spring, or at least they were, where we were given the option to resume face-to-face teaching. But of course, with the caveats that we would have to recognize the social distancing measures, wear masks, and also have Zoom available for those students who can't come to the class. And I'm just like, well, why? Like, fuck it, just keep it remote. I mean,
yeah, it'd just be a crap show because, you know, like myself, I'll just say that I do not believe in the effectiveness of masks. And so it would be really annoying to have, like, you know, everyone policing each other, and you're going to have a good portion of the population that feel the same. So it'd be a pretty much a shit show if they try and make it like, oh, everywhere you go, you have to wear a mask, even when you're on the toilet, you know.
well, I for my part, have no interest in teaching with a mask if I don't have to. Of course, I'll do it if it turns out to be a necessity in the future. But yeah, if I can just continue to do it remote while we face this perhaps worsening pandemic as it appears to be, then that's fine for me.
Well, it's also politically based because they just reopened all the restaurants and stuff in California, and most of the states are opening everything now because the election's over. Even though like things are going up, things are now reopening nationwide. So it's a lot politically driven more than actually, you know, health related. So
I don't know about that. I don't want to descend into the depths of cynicism in that way. I don't know, but there is certainly a tension between health concerns and the necessity of economic activity. But yeah. Well, and also just the idea of having in-person classes while maintaining the virtual possible participation, talking to three-dimensional people, then two-dimensional people, then looking at the chat. It just sounds like a circus to me. So, but yeah, so we're gonna hang with it. But today we're gonna transition, well, not really transition, but we'll take up a conversation of the last object of focus or investigation for the first unit of the course, which has been all about personal identity and selfhood. So now we're moving from the Humean empiricist and Buddhist conception of self as illusory, or in other words, the no self view, to a relational conception of the self via, at least in an intermediate way, the 19th century philosopher Hegel. So I asked you guys to read this chapter of John Russin's recent book. So he's a contemporary Canadian philosopher who actually allowed me to use this chapter for the purposes of the class. Oh, what video? Sorry, I'm getting distracted by the chat here. Oh, okay, cool.
They're talking about mass.
Yeah, some information there. All right. Yeah, so we'll talk about Hegel directly. So I want to talk about the so-called Herr and Knecht dialectic, or in English, master-slave dialectic, derived from kind of the first part, more or less, of his monumental Phenomenology of Spirit, right? So here's the book we're dealing with here. And I mentioned the difficulty, the widely reviled obscurity, perhaps even obscurantism of Hegel. But let me just read a sentence for you to give you a concrete taste of what I'm getting at. Let's see, what's a good fun one from this? Well, this is fine. In this experience, self-consciousness learns that life is an essential, or is as essential to it as pure self-consciousness. In immediate self-consciousness, the simple I is absolute mediation and has as its essential moment lasting independence. The dissolution of that simple unity is the result of the first experience. Through this, there is posited a pure self-consciousness, and a consciousness which is not purely for itself, but for another, i.e. is a merely immediate consciousness, or consciousness in the form of thinghood. Both moments are essential. Since to begin with, they are unequal and opposed, and the reflection into a unity has not yet been achieved, they exist as two opposed shapes of consciousness. One is the independent consciousness, whose essential nature is to be for itself. The other is the dependent consciousness, whose essential nature is simply to live or to be for another. And that was actually relatively clear. I mean, that makes pretty immediate intuitive sense to me. But of course, I have some familiarity with Hegel and his writings. And so I could easily cull another more stultifying passage from this work, but I won't do that. But we can occasionally go back to it. There are several paragraphs in succession that have contributed to quite a bit of scholarship in the subsequent century and our current century, so the 20th and 21st centuries. Hegel is a monumental force behind much of the substance in contemporary and recent, historically speaking, civil rights movements. And so we'll talk about that connection too. And I did mention a couple weeks ago around MLK Jr. Day that Hegel was Martin Luther King Jr.'s favorite philosopher. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. But before we get into that material, and I want to ask you guys first your impressions for those who are able to read Russin. And just looking ahead as well for this week, we're going to move to, on Thursday, we're still talking about the relational conception of self, but as we've been doing periodically, we'll engage with a fictional kind of contribution to this discourse through the work of the Oregonian speculative fiction, sci-fi writer Ursula K Le Guin. Has anybody read Le Guin before? Any novels or short stories?
The Hegel book looks interesting though. Like he references a lot of his different chapters, or who's referencing Hegel's writing references different chapters that sound interesting. And that divine, so is it divine self-consciousness or divine something? But he references like a few different books he's written.
Oh, John Russin?
Yeah, John Russin, yeah.
Yeah, he's really interesting, a very clear writer. So that's in part why I decided to assign this essay in putting us into a position to confront and think through Hegel's philosophy. And so, yeah, Le Guin doesn't refer to Hegel at all in the course of this short story that we'll be discussing on Thursday. So this story is called 9 Lives. It was published in 1969, first in Playboy magazine, and then it was later included in a bigger volume of Le Guin's short stories a few years later. But it's one of the earliest sci-fi stories that takes up the metaphysical, social, political, and ethical dimensions of the prospect of human cloning. And so it really puts us in a position to think through these paradoxes of individual self-consciousness and confronting the consciousness of another. And so it puts up a picture of personal identity or selfhood as a kind of unclosed, or in other words, open whole. So we are all these wholes or totalities, if you wish, but infinitely revisable in terms of being open to otherness. And in fact, it's that openness to the other and the other's self-presentation, which is substantially constitutive, that is in a very significant, irreducibly significant sense of who we are as individuals. And so another way to put that is we are all fragmentary wholes, which sounds contradictory, but then Hegel is the modern philosopher of contradiction. And so much of his work can be seen as a repudiation of Aristotle's major principle of logic, the principle of non-contradiction, which we'll talk a little bit about when we return to Hume. And so, yeah, so that's just to kind of set up our conversation for this week. And so I'll ask your impressions. And so Joshua, you clearly already read the Hegel essay, and so I'll ask your general impressions about that. But I wanted to briefly take us back to the presentation from last week. And so I wanted to walk us through the so-called 5 Skandas or aggregates, which are taken up and discussed in wildly confusing and contradictory ways in that famous Heart of Wisdom Sutra. And so I'm going to rely on an interpretation by Thich Nhat Hanh, whom we've already talked about and the presenters took up too last week, but then also a contemporary Buddhist monk, Bernie Glassman, who just passed away a couple of years ago. But he's very respected in Buddhist, Mahayana Buddhist circles in the US. And he was also very fascinatingly, independently of his role as a Buddhist and teacher, he's a clown. Right? So, and it's really lovely to me to think of the juxtaposition of these profound insights of Buddhism and then someone's role as a clown, right? To introduce humor and levity and to destabilize problematic seriousness. And so I think it's really cool. And so I just wanted to talk about the first slide that we kind of jumped over and bypassed last week, where we unpack those 5 skandhas. So let's see. And so as the presenters mentioned last time, so in particular, I think it was Abraham who mentioned these aggregates or heaps. So skanda from the Sanskrit is sometimes translated to aggregate, which sounds very mathematical, very quantitative and abstract. And so the less pretentious or more conventional or everyday idea of a heap is sometimes presented. And the translation is certainly accurate in that way. And so I'm motivated here first by Thich Nhat Hanh. And so an additional chapter in the text from which I pulled interbeing, the very brief chapter on interbeing, which Robin walked us through at the close of last week's presentation. An additional chapter is called Empty of What, right? So the Bodhisattva notices, and we find this, of course, in the sutra, that each of these skandhas that constitute the person, the self, as it were, are empty, right? So that's what the sutra says. They are empty and, well, I don't want to get back into that specific language, but each of these is empty in its own particular way. And then the recognition of that emptiness is a necessary step towards the at least approximation of some kind of wisdom But the real attainment of wisdom occurs as a qualitative leap, as it were. And this is why, and I mentioned this in a couple of my responses to your annotations in the engaged reading assignment. And so I can't remember who it was specifically, maybe Micah was talking about, and he made a very good observation that in that particular sutra, the idea of wisdom was presented. So the heart of wisdom, right? So the Heart Sutra really means heart of wisdom. And so meditating on the mantra at the end that everything is gone, gone, gone forever, is supposed to bring you towards wisdom. But then earlier in the sutra, it says, there is no wisdom, even wisdom is empty. And so, of course, there's a tension, if not a paradox at play here. But Mike, I think, mentioned that knowledge or wisdom is sometimes understood to be knowledge, right? Those are interchangeable. And certainly in the Greek tradition, when we find words like Sophia and episteme translated to English, it's rather ambivalent when we find the translation as knowledge or wisdom. It's not exactly precise. And so there is something of a confusion in our Western intellectual tradition about that. But from this particular Buddhist orientation or point of view, knowledge as the progressive acquisition of what we might call propositional facts, right? So facts that can be disclosed or articulated in clear propositional or sentential language. So facts like there are 7 days in a week, right? This coffee cup is on the table. Water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, right? The acquisition of these determinate facts in clear propositional language that can be preserved and communicated to others constitutes the ever amassing, overarching edifice of knowledge. And so one idea might be that if you attain all of those facts, well, then you can get wisdom. So in this sense, episteme, as scientific knowledge, is understood to be in kind of this Aristotelian tradition as a necessary pathway to the attainment of Sophia, or philosophical wisdom. But that's not what we really find in the inheritance of this Buddhist thought tradition. Rather, propositional facts, understood to be the heart of this incremental acquisition of knowledge, is really an obstacle to the path of wisdom, because we get more and more knowledge piece by piece, but wisdom amounts to use the metaphor, once you have acquired this profound body of knowledge in the form of propositional truths or facts, as a kind of ladder, you only get to the point of pure intuitive wisdom, this sort of immediacy in the presence of the now, when you look back and push that ladder away, right? You no longer have the ladder. And so knowledge in that sense can lead to pretension, can lead to arrogance, can lead for the misguided or sort of groping and ambiguous pursuit of more and more knowledge, this sort of Faustian impetus, right, which is identified in many ways with like the figure of Lucifer in Christian theology. But now so going back to Thich Nhat Hanh, he says, all of these elements or Skandas or heaps that contribute to one's personal identity are empty, but what does it mean to say anything is empty? So if I observe that this coffee cup, for example, is empty, well, I mean that it's empty of something, right? So if we say that each of these elements that make up the person is empty, then we have to be clear of what they are empty. And so Hahn's response, and this is where we get the very concept of interbeing, is that each of these elements that make up the person is precisely empty of permanence and independence. So each points to the other, each in some sense relies upon the other. And so by way of Thich Nhat Hanh's interpretation of the sutra, we find ourselves pushing towards, rather than an illusory understanding of selfhood, a more relational conception of selfhood. So pushing us towards something like Hegelian phenomenology. And phenomenology, by the way, it's a fancy word, but derived from Greek, really just means investigation of phenomena, right? So it's made up of phenomenon and logos. Logos can mean, and so I'll restrict the sense at this point for clarity, study of or investigation into. And then phenomenon means literally that which appears, that which shows itself. And so Hegel is trying to give us an early science, so to speak, of appearances. How is it possible for things to show up? And hence what he's giving us is, as we'll see, a logic of nature itself in the more or less eternal process of finite or temporal unfolding. And so we'll talk about that some more. But let's look at these individual heaps or skandas via an interpretation. And so that's the English language unpacking or explanations here via Bernie Glassman. So first of all, there is form, which should be understood as body. So this is the sense of appearances, perhaps, that we can associate or bring close to the notion that Hegel's working with. So body, immediate appearances. My body and the sensations that are brought about or introduced to me through my intercourse with things in the outside world. So from the Sanskrit, that's rupa. And then feelings is what gets translated here from Vedana. And so Bernie Glassman understands that to be simple internal response to sensation, like an immediate affective response, that is in terms of emotion. And then perceptions or sana, Glassman takes as an external reaction to feelings, where now instead of an internal response, your body is motivated to behave in a certain way. And then mental formations is when the mind catches up with experience and puts a kind of label on the object or the event, which circumscribes it and limits it in a certain way, which can be quite problematic, as we'll see. And then consciousness should be understood as this ever-expanding storehouse of memories and experiences that we can draw from and in which we make large narrative connections, this kind of linkage. So this is very close to what Hegel has in mind as Geist, this sort of historically unfolding, coming into its own of universal consciousness. But now let's walk back through these using a specific case, a specific event or kind of experience that we all might be familiar with, to make sense of how this Buddhist insight can concretely be very helpful in our everyday lives. So imagine you're sitting there, I don't know, maybe in the plaza in Ashland, you're sitting on one of the nice benches beside some beautiful shrubbery and you're reading. Maybe I would hope you're reading for this class. You're sitting there, just absorbed in what you're thinking about and reading. And then suddenly you hear a bang, a really loud, jarring explosion. Well, not that loud. So it's something in the street. It jars you. And suddenly your consciousness is ripped from what you're thinking about or reading. And so that is, so the sound that impacts your ears, that is in this case form, that is rupa, this immediate bodily sensation. Now what happens, without you even thinking about it, suddenly you get this sort of intuitive sense, I don't like that. Right? That bothered me, that disturbed me, right? That's not good. This kind of judgment takes place in your reflection. So you hear the immediate sound, there's a sensory impact on your organ, and now internally you respond. You say, that's bad, I don't like that. Step 3, perceptions. Now your body responds to the external stimulus in accordance with that internal judgment. So now maybe you jump up or you turn your head to figure out the source of the disturbance. And then now you realize at step 4, mental formations. This is where we attach conceptual labels to phenomena, to things that appear in the course of our experience. So now you recognize that it was actually a car muffler backfiring, right? So you jump up, you look, and you say, oh, it's a car muffler backfiring. So you attach a label to it. It packages the experience neatly for you. You know what the thing is. And then you get to consciousness, where you connect the way in which your concept has circumscribed and limited the phenomenalization, that is the ongoing sensuous appearing of the thing. You have, and that's really what concept means. It's, think of it like, and the word Hegel uses is actually very helpful from the German, Begriff. So grief means in German like grasp, like you grip something, you grab it. And then Begriff is like a kind of action. So the concept grabs the phenomenon, it grabs the sensuous or material appearance and constrains it, limits, and defines it in a very precise, or as the case may be, a less precise, open-ended way. And then at the level of consciousness, you take that concept, which has labeled, defined, and made sense of what you just experienced, and now you find yourself, again, without even necessarily conscious of this or deliberately engaged in this process, you find yourself thinking beyond the immediacy of the experience, beyond the concept, to all sorts of things. So now you're thinking about the car, you're thinking about the car's muffler, you're thinking about the automobile's exhaust system as a part of the internal combustion engine design. And then you think about all the carbon that the muffler is pumped out. And then you think, oh, climate change. And then you think of suddenly the acidification of the oceans. And then you think of the extreme weather patterns we've been experiencing, droughts, fires, unanticipatable storms, and so forth. And then suddenly you're thinking at this point of the destruction of the entire world. Right? And so what has happened here? You're just sitting there reading, and because of some moment, some experiential openness to what is outside of you, and your efforts, because of these essential elements that make up the human being, the kind of beings that we are in the world, you've gone from sitting there on a bench, hearing a sound, to reflecting in tremendous anxiety about the very end of the world, right? And so if you're aware of what's happening, and this is the Buddhist practical insight, if you're aware of these steps and the way in which each iteration that unfolds through this process, and it doesn't exactly have to unfold in precisely the terms that I've laid out here through the interpretation of Bernie Glassman. It can be a little bit different, but this is one story about how that might take place. If you recognize what's happening here, that these structures of your basic consciousness are led sort of against their own reflective powers along these paths, which can be very anxiety-inducing, very destabilizing, very problematic in terms of our affective, emotional well-being. Well then, as I mentioned last time, you can understand this when you're considering self-consciously, and meditation facilitates this distance, what's going on in each of these steps. You can perceive this as an invitation to recognize the emptiness of each of these, right? You can think, well, maybe I don't have to push myself along this pathway of despair where I'm considering the annihilation of the entire world because I heard a sound. That doesn't mean, though, and this is the kind of Zen perspective we can draw from, that you ought to thrust yourself into a kind of passive nihilism or quietism, where you withdraw entirely from the world and don't care about anything. It just means that caring about the world, having compassion for suffering, and so forth, doesn't necessarily have to take the form of your own acute, pronounced suffering in the most everyday, typical, or banal situations, like this one, of you relaxing on a park bench enjoying a read and are disturbed by an environmental sound, right? Does that make sense? How this might, this kind of interpretation from the sutra might be deployed in a less obscure and more helpful sense in terms of our struggles with contemporary sources of anxiety in the world. Okay. So any final comments or questions about that stuff, about Han or this, or the sutra, or Bernie Glassman's interpretation? No? Everybody good? Makes sense? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm checking the chat. Daniel, oh, cool, you read The Left Hand of Darkness and The Dispossessed. Great, yeah, those are I think probably her two most famous novels. Yeah. Yeah, certainly a product of the time. Yeah, really cool stuff. I recently acquired, what's it called? The Lathe of Heaven. It's a really short novel, and just you reminded me of it because the cover of the novel, it's from the 60s. It's like super trippy, like psychedelic looking, and I haven't yet read it, but I really love the artwork on these older pulp novels before sci-fi had yet really been elevated to intellectual seriousness and being accepted in that kind of degree of importance or relevance. Cool. Okay, so any questions or anything about that before we transition to Hegel? All right, so like I said before, I'm interested to hear your impressions, if not about Hegel the thinker, your experience reading John Russon's chapter, which really can be engaged with as a standalone essay of a sort. So the writing is different, of course, than what we've experienced so far. The only contemporary work that we've read up to this point was of John Perry from the 1970s, but that was, of course, a dialogue, a work of fiction. And so this is what we're finding here, a work of contemporary philosophy. So this was published just about 5 years ago or so. So what was your experience reading it? Are there any points of confusion that you'd like to ask about, or anywhere in the text you want to focus on before we take up a discussion of Hegel?
I like how he's talking about how like freedom is actually a topic that kind of what was it called? Not supersedes, but like I guess supersedes someone else's like interconnection with you. Like by, yeah, it was interesting to explore that. That was cool.
Oh, so how
The concept of freedom, like how, like if you're going to do something free, like the idea of free is almost kind of like what I read was like he kind of shows it's coming like almost not necessarily bad, but like it, by you being free, you're kind of doing something without consideration of your immediate people around you and the effects it has. And so like we associate freedom as like a really strong thing, but it was interesting how you kind of went that lens with it. But
yeah, so I think you're considering that example of so he uses this example to flesh out the idea. And the example is if you're in a room with someone and you're enjoying the fresh air from an open window, and then someone maybe not even recognizing that you are intentionally sitting by the window to enjoy the fresh air, they get up and close it. In that move, expressing or manifesting, or really in a strong sense, communicating, even if they're unaware of this, their freedom, saying, this is what I'm doing, I don't give a shit what you're doing. And so in the communicative element of the act or the gesture, you recognize a check on your own freedom, some other consciousness, some other source of motive force in the world is denying you. And so in that sense, freedom has a negative capacity. And negative, I mean in a strict philosophical sense, not just as a synonym for bad. And so that's important to keep in mind when reading Hegel and Hegelian philosophy. Negative means Negative in the strong active verbal sense means to attach a not to some positive being. So positive meaning immediacy, givenness, like the positive presence of an object like this coffee cup. And one of the major insights taken from Hegel's phenomenology is that unlike immediate natural material being, such as the being of this coffee cup, consciousness is negative, right? Consciousness is like a source of denial or absence. Why? Because my consciousness, which unfolds through my open thinking about and engaging with the outside world, it can deny, that is, it can strive to annihilate aspects of the outside world, even the what I might interpret to be the transgressive sort of resistance of another human consciousness. I can strive to deny that. But in my striving to deny that, I'm implicitly recognizing the force of that other consciousness in its negativity is denying me, right? Whereas this coffee cup doesn't exactly do that. And so the problem of freedom there as purely abstract or negative is, so as purely negative, is that it is simply abstract. And so Hegel isn't challenging the importance of freedom. In fact, his philosophy is about, through the historical progression of what he calls spirit, which is like the unity of self-consciousness and how it is articulated through cultural products and institutions in which we recognize ourselves, right? That historical unfolding is ultimately pointed towards the aim of emancipation, of universal freedom. And so then true, concrete, real freedom, actual freedom, amounts to a place in which we're talking about a social or cultural milieu or system in which consciousnesses are engaged in acts of equal recognition, where we don't abstractly try to negate the negativity of the other's consciousness and reduce it to pure positivity. That is, I would try to reduce your consciousness to the kind of positivity in its immediacy that I encounter in the object of this coffee cup, right? That would mean trying to reduce you to a physical thing, which I can then manipulate as a tool for my own ends. That's not true freedom, according to Hegel, because in exercising that freedom for my part, I am at the same time recognizing your freedom by trying to coerce you, by trying to persuade you, by trying to beat you down. I'm recognizing your freedom because I'm not treating you exactly as I would treat a coffee cup, right? I don't just like come over and pick you up and start doing things to you. That's not how it works. So I recognize your freedom at the same time that I'm denying your freedom. And that's a contradiction which is ultimately unsustainable. It's unsatisfying, both for the person who would be oppressed or exploited, and ultimately for the one who's doing the oppression and the exploitation.
That was my favorite part of this section. It's kind of precisely what you just said, and like in context of like relating to each other, like, you know, it's kind of like that concept's really easy to overlook, but very valuable in, you know, intimate partnerships and family relationships. Like, yeah, just like recognizing the other person's essentially consciousness or how their interdependence related with you. And, you know, we make decisions to have them in mind too. So you both have a net benefit that makes you feel good, because using that makes you feel good, but the other person feels bad, then you're kind of enslaved to that kind of feeling of, oh, you're in conflict. So that conflict, you don't really experience freedom because now you're in that kind of dynamic. And otherwise, the window analogy, like, oh, I'm hot, I'm cold, basement's cold, I'll put more clothes on. You go to basement, I put clothes on, we're good. We don't need the window open, or whatever the agreement can be. Then you're both free.
Yeah.
So that's cool.
Yeah, so that would amount to communication, right? Where you solicit the other for their interpretation of the situation and give them the openness to express their desire, which in some sense is a check in its negativity on your desire. But then you start to recognize that your desire itself doesn't exist in a vacuum. um, and so then we can really begin, although we're moving out of a discussion of Buddhism and Hume, I'd like to sort of leap back into the week we spent on Descartes. And so I mentioned this term, and actually some of you, I think Fia actually, in one of your discussion forum contributions, mentioned the term solipsism. But does anyone remember what that means, or has anyone encountered that? I don't think that we've explicitly discussed it as a concept in class yet, but we sort of danced around it when discussing Descartes. But does anyone know what solipsism means? Anybody? Fia, are you there? Do you remember? I think it was you who used the word. No, maybe not. Well, think back now to the two meditations. So at the end of the first meditation, the meditator is unclear whether he can be certain of anything. So the only certainty could be that there is no certainty. When we emerge from the close of the second meditation, what's the certainty that he has? So it's no longer that nothing is certain. He has achieved some certainty, real certainty, but what is it?
It's that only your own mind can be said to definitely exist.
Yeah, so that's where we find ourselves if we're reading along, thinking along introspectively with the meditator. We think, okay, and this is true for John Pollock's story in the case of Mike, the main character. He can at least know that he exists, but he can't be sure whether or not anyone else he encounters in the course of his everyday dealings actually exist. So this is known as the problem of other minds, and Descartes uses it as an example, sort of prematurely leaving the problem behind, actually, of the work of intellect in our making sense of the world as intelligible. And so the world as intelligible is obviously such that it's made up of other individuals who are persons with minds with whom we interact. But he says, if you look out the window, putting to work, of course, only your eyes, you see some people walking around. He mentioned some men with hats and coats. If we're relying only on our visual perception, so sense experience, then we might suppose that they're not actually people at all. They could be automatons, so robots or something like that, zombies, right? So in Descartes, we get a really early sort of conceptual thought experiment, if you will, involving zombies. But now at this point in the 21st century, after the annoyance that was The Walking Dead, I don't know if people still watch that, but I don't know, people are probably tired of zombies at this point. But yeah, so Descartes, in his strict dualism, held open the possibility that people that we encounter in our ordinary experience, they could, by all external observation, in terms of their activities, their practices, what seems to be the product of intentional choices, all of that could just be entirely mechanical, without any accompanying inward consciousness, without any affective emotional states or conditions. So that's really what we mean by zombies. And the 20th century and really contemporary Australian philosopher David Chalmers, who in many ways is a jackass. He's bragged about being a philosopher and having never read Plato, but we can leave that aside. But in any case, Chalmers has this experiment, this thought experiment, as an analytic philosopher known as the philosophical zombie. And I should warn you that the philosophical zombie is not anywhere as interesting as the pop cultural zombie. The philosophical zombie in this thought experiment is someone whom I just described by way of Descartes in the second meditation in terms of a possibility of the state of things. So a philosophical zombie is someone who they go to bed at night, they speak language, they communicate what appears to be thoughts, they open the refrigerator, get food out and eat it, they go to work. In Chalmers' language, you can imagine someone, and this is a kind of intuition pump. So he's inviting you to imagine this, to conceive of it. You can imagine someone who is atom by atom, molecule by molecule, identical to an existing human person that you know. And in virtue of that identical structure, behaves in precisely the ways that one would expect an ordinary person to do, so carrying out all these typical human functions. But the only difference is, for every function, for every act, there's no corresponding mental state. So it's just empty. It's like a robot or a machine. And so Chalmers uses this thought experiment, since we can conceive of that, and that would be the philosophical zombie. So if you made a movie about philosophical zombies, it would be exactly like any other movie, except the only difference is the characters have no real emotional inner life or true subjective self-consciousness. So this thought experiment, according to Chalmers, means that there is a fundamental difference in kind between consciousness and any corresponding material brain states. That you could have these brain states that a neuroscientist, for instance, could locate and map through like an fMRI or something. But in terms of our subjective experience or interiority, there would be no corresponding mental states. So for this reason, Chalmers argues that consciousness is epiphenomenal to physical organization. But going back to Descartes, solipsism is the state in which we can only be certain of our own existence as selves or as identity, but we of course have no access to the inner subjective lives of others. And so we might remain forever suspicious that we are in fact the center of the world. And for those, I don't know, did anyone did anyone have time to read the Robert Heinlein short story, They, that I made available? It was optional. So Heinlein's a famous sci-fi writer of the 20th century. Did anyone read that? Well, that gives you the story of solipsism. So the main character is institutionalized because he really believes that there is some grand conspiracy, that he's living in some kind of simulation, and he eventually accuses his wife even of being one of them, and he ends up in this asylum. But I won't give you the end, I won't spoil it for you, but so that's what solipsism is, that you can only be self-certain. Everything beyond you is questionable. And so if Descartes is right, if the way he understands consciousness is correct or accurate, well then we find ourselves beginning with this Cartesian foundation at the very beginning of Hegel's story of abstract self-consciousness. So what does that mean? Here you are, this insulated little bubble of consciousness that is somehow floating alongside the world and others that you encounter in the world as substantially different from it. And this is known usually pejoratively in the literature as the Cartesian Theater, right? So there's like this homunculus, literally this little man in your mind's eye, so to speak, that gathers all of the products of your sensory openness to the world, synthesizes them into a unity, which is where we find the seat of mentation or of intellection or of consciousness itself. And then we have this representational capture of everything. And so Descartes gives us representationalism, which means we don't have immediate access to the objects that we encounter in the outside world of our experience, but we have these mental representations of those objects, which may or may not be accurate. And that's why we're sometimes mistaken in our sensory engagement with things. That's why we're sometimes wrong. And so it's really the necessity of the strong non-sensory intellect to find out what is essential in all of our experiences, to parse through the difficult and potentially obscuring layers of sense to find out what is true, what is real. And that amounts to, as we've seen, mathematizable or quantifiable properties that we would want to measure in various scientific applications, right? So Descartes was one of the progenitors of what we call now modern science or the scientific method. But so then from this point of view, we are all our own isolated, insulated little self-consciousnesses, which in each instance is self-certain only, right? But that's not satisfying, even for Descartes. And so he's able to get us out of that eventually, but only through the bridge of God, which is very strange. According to Descartes, we can know that we exist because of the immediate intuitive truth of the cogito argument, but we can't yet be certain that anything else exists unless we rely on the omnibenevolence of the creator, who wouldn't actually foist upon us these sort of violent obscurities and dangerous illusions and so forth. And so through the bridge of God, through Descartes, or for Descartes, we're able to get to reality, which is made up of other minds and so forth. But Hegel, building on that abstract starting point of these isolated self-consciousnesses, tells a story for us. And this is the story of the master-slave dialectic, of how that doesn't work. What Descartes tells us is the essence of self-consciousness, or if you will, the essence of personal identity or selfhood, is only partial. It's necessarily incomplete. And that constitutional incompleteness or hollowness will always explode beyond itself. It will always give way in this sort of other directed move, which ultimately, paradoxically, but this is to be expected with a philosopher like Hegel, paradoxically, when we break open the little bubble of consciousness that each of us are, we are rendering it no longer whole. It's no longer whole. It's now open and split, kind of broken and partial, but only now are we restored to ourselves as a true whole. So imagine the kind of person that you would be if Descartes' insight is correct and is the whole story, or if Avicenna's insight is correct and is the whole story, that essentially at bottom, most fundamentally, you are this pure consciousness, divorced from anything else in the world. Hegel's insight is that can't hold up. That necessarily gives way and dissolves itself towards this openness towards the other. So what we find is, building on the ancient dialectic now that Socrates introduced to this intellectual tradition, which is a dialectic as dialogue between individual souls, so using the Platonic language of suke, now that becomes a kind of fundamental logic for Hegel, dialectic, which in Socrates was interpersonal dialogue, which is the very mechanism of philosophy and the pursuit of wisdom. Now dialectic is understood to be an essential logic at the very heart of reality itself, which drives history, which drives personal development, which drives social change, and is directed teleologically towards the final end of universal freedom or emancipation, which in a very puzzling way, Hegel thought had actually occurred in 19th century Germany. That was for Hegel the end of history. We had done it. But of course, that's clearly not the case, right? Okay, so are there any questions about that? I have a short video that's like 2 minutes. It's very helpful. Well, the whole video is 30 minutes, but I only want to show 2 minutes of it because the rest of it is this particular person's interpretation of Hegel, which I think is mostly disastrous. So I don't want to expose that to you. It's not helpful. It's misleading. But the first 2 minutes of the video are very dramatic and fun, and I think are helpful for understanding where Hegel is coming from. So I'll watch this 2-minute video, we'll take a short break, and then we'll come back and resume this conversation. So let me pull it up here. All right. And so this is a guy who runs, well, actually, let me see, this person doesn't run it, but this person is, the person depicted in this video is a contributor, I guess, to this YouTube channel called Philosophy Tube. So let me share the screen. And I've seen other videos that this particular person has prepared, and they're pretty helpful in a lot of cases. So let me full screen. Okay, here we go.
What are you? You're like me, but you aren't me. What are you? An object? An animal? Are you looking at me? Wait, if you're looking at me, then there's a me. I exist, and you exist. But if there's a me, then there's a you. And that means there is a not me. Something exists that is the negation of myself. Other. Every time I see you, I'm reminded of my negation. And if there's more than one being like me, then at the end of the day, what's left for me to be? I'll kill you. But if I kill you, then you won't be there to look at me. And if you're not there to look at me, how will I know I'm here? I can't kill you, but I can make your life miserable. It's a stalemate. But never forget, I could kill you anytime. From now on, my self-consciousness is rooted in being better than you, being able to destroy you at any moment and replace you with someone who looks identical. You exist to serve me by reinforcing my conception of myself. That's what makes me the master and you the slave. But wait, I could never get rid of you. You'll always be there, reminding me of my negation with your otherness. Your whole presence is a totalizing violence to me. I need you. I need you to recognize me. But even if you do, I hate you so much, your recognition isn't satisfying. My whole identity is built around dominating you. I need you, but you don't need me anymore. Part 2. What the hell was that? Hegel's master and slave dialectic. It's an odd one, to be sure.
All right, so that's all I wanted to show from that. But did that make some sense to you, or what are some thoughts that you had about that? So that was, imagine Descartes' story of self-consciousness. This Cartesian ego finds itself encountering another Cartesian ego. That's the story Hegel tells of what would happen. So, yeah, okay, what the hell is that? Do you guys have so any thoughts about that, or did it resonate with you in connection to the reading, or anything else?
This is a funny spiral to be on the other person giving you identity and you having identity yourself, and just kind of looping those two concepts and kind of spiraling it down of different dynamics of you know, domination, power, control, self-acceptance, self-identity, responsibility of other to form your self-identity. So
Yeah, and the idea that our identities, in the concrete sense of real world practical development, never take root in isolation from other consciousnesses and from other normative contexts. And so we, in an important sense, receive ourselves from the other, making our dependence on the other quite substantial in the hopeful growth or maturation of our own independence. And so again, paradoxically, Hegel's insight here is that, and this is picked up on by major drivers of our recent civil rights movements, so I'll say more than one, the idea that in terms of the oppressor or the master or the dominator, we're dealing with the pretense of a strong self-assertion or independence. But the insight here is that that independence is in fact dependent upon the recognition of the other. And because of that contradiction, the false abstract independence, the sort of illusory or pretended independence, as the first moment of this process, is compelled to break beyond itself and to be stretched, as it were, towards the pole of the other, in what might constitute, in a healthy social arrangement organization, legitimately concrete, stable, productive, and flourishing self-consciousness. And that's what Hegel identifies culturally as spirit or Geist. It is the I, as he puts it, the I that is a we and a we that is an I, such that I see myself given back to myself in the existing social and cultural structures that make up the world of my historical moment. Even beyond the ways in which the other as individual self-consciousnesses that I engage with, interact with, and encounter in my everyday dealings achieve that. And so Hegel calls culture second nature in that way. It's this kind of second skin beyond our ordinary sort of material, natural skin, if you will, as this sort of ongoing developmental membrane that is really the place in which consciousness emerges. So consciousness isn't something in here. Consciousness is something that develops through an ongoing fundamental logic that lies at the very heart of reality. And we'll talk about that logic in just a moment. But are there any questions or comments before we take a quick break? All right, so let's take a quick break and then we'll come back. And I've put together a few slides to help us work through the dialectic here towards a relational view of self. So I'll see you guys in just a few minutes. Let me pause this recording.